He, therefore, he got very interested in himself after a while, and he heard about this one kind of mushroom that was used in Mexico as part of shamanic rituals. They call it the magic mushroom or psilocybin. So he went and met this woman, this shamaness named Maria Sabina, and he was led through, he was the first non-Native American to go through a magic mushroom ritual with Maria Sabina, and then after he had this experience, he actually, there was an article in Life magazine about it, and Hoffman saw that, and he wrote to Watson, and actually Watson brought him to see Maria Sabina eventually. In fact, when I went to see Hoffman, which was in 1976, many years later, after this, I'd been a hippie, in the 60s, and so when I went to Basel, I was still pretty much of a hippie, and I camped out in the campgrounds. And so when I met Hoffman the first time, we had lunch, and he said, "Oh, where did you stay last night? What hotel?" And I said, "Oh, I camped out." He said, "Oh, I camped out once." And I said, "Once?" So yeah, it was when I was with Gordon Watson in Mexico, and so Hoffman brought some of this mushrooms back with him to analyze, and he discovered that the active ingredient, so he's actually credited as not only being the discoverer of LSD, but of psilocybin, which is the active ingredient of, and which, as we saw before, looks an awful lot like serotonin, almost identical to serotonin, but which is active. There's also another variant of psilocybin, something called dimethyltryptamine, or DMT, and there's actually some endogenous LSD in the brain itself. In fact, they passed a law against drugs. It was called the Analogs Act of 1986, I think. And some of the drugs that it makes any drug that's similar to any of the psychedelic drugs illegal, right? But the wording of it is such that some of the chemicals in our brains are actually illegal too, because some of them is related to psilocybin. There's another. It was interesting. He also discovered that there were these flowers. There were these large morning glories in Mexico that were also used by the shamans, and these were different than the morning glories that grow here, but they all contain. We found out that they all contain lysergic acid. So it's interesting that here this lower form of plants, these ergot and these flowers were both, which are a higher form of plant evolution, both contain lysergic acid. So he was really interested in that. He was really proud of his discovery about that. And but like I said, LSD was kind of, he considered it his problem child. And the reason why he considered it his problem child is that there's a great deal of interest by all of these artists and writers. Turned into a great deal of interest among a larger and larger number of people as the 60s evolved. Back when Huxley wrote Doors of Perception, hardly anybody had used these things. And even as late as when Huxley died in 1963, they still hadn't, but over the next few years, more and more people started experimenting with LSD from supplies that were, from these research projects, and then eventually some of it started getting made by, chemists who were not part of pharmaceutical companies, and until in 1964, there were 1 million people who used LSD in the United States, and by 1966, there were about 2 million. But by then, they made LSD illegal. Now, one of the people who Hoffman had sent some, when Hoffman discovered the psilocybin, he started sending out samples of that to researchers as well to have them tested. And one of the guys who got some of the psilocybin was Professor Timothy Leary at Harvard University. In 1960, Leary got some samples of it. He had already taken magic mushrooms, so he was kind of curious about them. He'd been taken to Mexico and given some magic mushrooms by another professor there at Harvard, Frank Barron. And so then Leary took these the psilocybin and he started using it in research projects. And some LSD that made its way over to a guy in New York named John Beresford, professor of psychiatry from Toronto, and he'd gotten a gram of it to test out on rats, and half of it went to a guy named Michael Hollingshead, who ended up turning on the Beatles and a whole bunch of different, cultural people in the early counterculture, and started spreading the stuff around. Leary actually took some of that too, and Leary became so messianic about it. One of the things that happens when you take LSD, sometimes at first, you think that you almost like know everything. Later on, I think as people, develop and use it, some people realize they don't know that much, but at the beginning they think they know, they've discovered the secret of everything. Now, like I say, the effects of LSD are widely varied and idiosyncratic. There are some people who should never use it, and those people don't know. It's hard to identify who they are, and it's hard for them to identify who they are, because there are people who have pre-existing mental disorders that are genetic and based in basis, for instance, bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, and these drugs can, in those cases, trigger off those types of experiences, or trigger off those types of latent tendencies in people, which therefore makes it, a tricky drug to know whether to qualify yourself or not with. Plus, another problem is that, back when these people were experimenting with it in the early 60s, they were getting, pure pharmaceutical LSD, but nowadays, it's impossible to even get the ingredients to make LSD. So they've made all the chemicals to even make the chemicals illegal. So it's almost impossible to get it in pure form. So anyway, Leary got very messianic about it and started giving lectures, and there was a number of other people who got very interested in it, and the rock groups of the 60s and so forth, and that led to the 60s movement. Was the catalyst of the 60s movement, because what it did was it actually almost created like a separate tribe. This picture over here is from what they call the first human being. When the hippies started out in Haight-Ashbury in the 60s, they put together a thing called the Human Being, which was a big gathering. They had Jefferson Airplane and Grateful Dead, which were rock groups back then, artists like, or poets like Allen Ginsberg and Timothy Leary and all these different people, and they would all come together, and it was a big giant party. But right around that time, they also made LSD illegal, and so it became a very polarized sort of thing. It was a tribe that was, basically became taboo tribe. It was warred on by the mainstream culture. Now, there's been 40 years of history since then, and it's really impossible for me to cover all of this here. I